are ready to get going on gaslighting and gender in the workplace. Hooray, such enthusiasm. Okay, so once again, I'm Holly. You all already know who I am because I just told you, but I want to tell you a little bit more about kind of who I am and where I've been, because you don't end up doing a talk about gaslighting and gender in the workplace due to academic curiosity or, because you think it'll, win you friends or something like that, right? I'm doing this talk because I think it really matters to all of you in the room, I hope. I think it really matters to the women I serve at WIMD. And also it's a thing that's happened to me tons in my career. And so, I know it's a problem because I watch it happen to people all the time, but I've also watched it happen to me. And, really everything that I do with WIMD and with the leadership coaching that I do is about helping women have better careers, longer careers, more sustainable careers, and helping them build up their leadership skills. And the way that I like to frame this, some of you may have seen this before if you've seen me talk before, is with the world's most upsetting graph. So I've braced you for it. Let's take a look. Here is the world's most upsetting graph. It is a graph of the amount of women that stay in their chosen field over time. So on the y-axis there is the percentage of women that stay in their career, and then along the bottom is the number of years they are into their overall career. And the yellow line is professional women in general, and the pink line is women in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And you might notice, like I do, that there's a tiny difference between the yellow and the pink line. They're not like really in the same area of this graph. In fact, some might say that the pink line is devastatingly low. And yeah, the pink line is devastatingly low. And everything that I do with WIMD, et cetera, is to make that pink line be closer to the yellow line, because the pink line haunts me. I don't like it. I think it's terrible that it sits down there. This is a really big tragedy. What we're talking about when we look at this graph is that over the course of a 20-year career, 60% of women that go into STEM fields eventually leave. That's huge. I mean, that's a problem for all those women. That's also a massively expensive problem for all these industries, right? It's kind of a nightmare. And I'm on this graph because I was a mining engineer before, and now I'm a leadership coach. And so I'm there sort of right around the 10-year mark, part of just slightly less than half of women who had left at that time, right? So there's a lot of tragedy here. And I think the most tragic part for me is the early part of the graph, because it's not like a slow decline, right? 37% have already left by the time they're 7 years in. 7 years in is kind of that time when you're starting to move into management, right? You've become a really good individual contributor. You've learned what you need to learn technically, and you're now starting to manage other people. But by the time that's happening, almost 40% of us have already gone, right? There's a whole bunch of things that create this gap. I mean, I think if I asked you to, heck, brainstorm with me. What do you think? Put in the chat. What do we think causes this graph? I'm sure we could come up with 100 items, right, of why women end up leaving earlier from these types of fields than from other fields. Yeah, and Charlotte's got one of them. She's understood that I'm setting y'all up for an answer, is gaslighting, right? Gaslighting is one of these reasons. I'm not saying it's the entire graph, but it's one of them. And that's why we're talking about it today, because I want to make sure that little by little, piece by piece, y'all get the tools so that you can end up closer to the top of this graph rather than sliding down that pink slide of despair, or whatever we want to call it. All right, so with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about gaslighting and see what we can do tonight to inch that pink line up a bit. Okay, so a little more about me. My nightmare in life is the idea that I might be the only one trying to make fetch happen. I don't want to be the only person in a room trying to sell an idea. Like, that person who is like, they've maybe got like a bit of an intense look in their eyes, and they're sitting there telling you their conspiracy theory and really trying to get you to buy in. And you're like, oh, this person couldn't get away from me fast enough. I'd like to leave this conversation. That's the thing that scares me. I don't want to be that person that is, so intensely believing in an idea that absolutely everybody else in the room thinks is just like not on, right? And the thing that I'm always asking myself, because I really don't want to be that person, is like, oh my God, am I that weirdo? Am I that like person that's out there trying to convince everybody else of my weird conspiracy theories? And let's talk a little bit about that. How could I maybe assess that, right? So if I wanted to know really if I'm that weird person that's trying a little too hard to make fetch happen and freaking out everybody around me, first ingredient to that, or clue, would be that I'm totally alone in my viewpoint. So, you know, for example, if I was trying to convince everybody in this room that Friday by Rebecca Black was the best song of my entire lifetime, I imagine, and you can contradict me if I'm wrong about this in the chat, but I imagine that that would not be a popular opinion in this room, that you'd all look at me like, really, Friday by Rebecca Black? Is that the best song you could come up with, Holly? And the answer is yes, absolutely. It is my favorite. So yeah, if I'm totally alone in my viewpoint, that's a clue that I might be kind of that weirdo, right? Another clue might be if all my explanations are useless. Like I can sit here probably and tell you that Friday by Rebecca Black is amazing because it's fun, and it's excellent for like partying, yeah. But I imagine that even if I remind you of all those amazing benefits and those fantastic lyrics from the best song in the universe, you're still not like the most excited about it? No? Still trying to make fetch happen? Okay. Well, a third ingredient about that is if the answer or the theory that you're trying to prove is super, super obvious to you, but really only obvious to you. So if I told y'all that I think that the most obvious thing in the world is that here in Vancouver, we should kick Seth Rogen out of our SkyTrain announcements and replace him on Friday with just streaming in Friday by Rebecca Black, I imagine that I would probably receive a little bit of pushback from TransLink about that, and that people would not feel as I do, that it would help everybody, you know, look forward to the weekend and get ready for more of the aforementioned partying, yeah, right? So if I'm in this situation where I feel all these amazing things about Rebecca Black and the rest of you quite reasonably don't, I would sit here going, Rebecca Black is a national treasure, and you would sit here going, yikes. Why did I choose to attend this talk, which it turns out is entirely about Rebecca Black? What a trap, right? Not good. So this is a bit frustrating for me. I wish that y'all would see the light about Rebecca Black, but you know, ultimately I'm going to be okay. I can survive this. I don't love that I'm the only person trying to make Rebecca Black happen, but it's kind of okay, right? Not really a big deal because it's a lighthearted example. And, you know, maybe I don't really have the right views about this. Maybe my taste kind of sucks. I'm certain some of you would say that. Or maybe actually my ideas are great, but just my communication style is not good. Like maybe there's a more persuasive way for me to have convinced you that this was an amazing song, or it could be any number of reasons. It's not really a big deal, right? But what if this is worse? Because I said this was my worst nightmare, right? It's weird that my worst nightmare is about Friday by Rebecca Black. So what if this was actually a more serious scenario? If it wasn't about like my questionable music taste, and it was about real life experiences that I had or strongly held beliefs that really mattered to me and affected my day-to-day functioning, then it would be worse if I was the only one fighting on behalf of that and everyone was like, whoa, what's this about, right? I'd start to really ask myself like, God, can I even trust myself? Like, I think that song's an absolute banger. Nobody else does. Is there something wrong with me? Not great, right? And eventually, if this persisted long enough and it was about something serious enough, I'd start to wonder, like, am I like kind of losing touch with reality a bit? Like, can I not perceive this correctly? Like when I hear Friday by Rebecca Black, I instantly want to dance. What's wrong with me? Why don't I get this? Am I hearing it differently than everybody else? So that's when it starts to get a little darker. And then we might be dealing with something a little more like gaslighting. So for those of you who don't know, gaslighting, textbook definition, is that it's the denial of somebody's lived experience, so much so that they begin to doubt their own perception, judgment, and sanity. So when I say lived experience, what I mean by that is like the objective facts of their life, the way that they experience the world. So gaslighting means that you deny the way that people experience the world so much that they start to doubt whether they've even got it all figured out. So one of the classic examples of this that I love to talk about in primarily Canadian audience context is Donald Trump. When he first got into office, he had a big inauguration and there were a bunch of photos taken. And he said, I had the biggest inauguration crowd ever. And when you looked at the photos, if y'all remember way back in 2017, and sorry for the flashbacks, those of you that are now remembering Donald Trump's inauguration, should have had a trigger warning probably. They were way emptier than, you know, Barack Obama's one that had just been a few years prior, right? And then Trump kind of deputized a bunch of minions to go on the news and be like, oh, we installed different things on the lawn, and in fact, we have more. But every single news outlet, including DC Transit, who counts the number of riders they have on any given day, everybody disagreed with Trump. But he said, nope, my crowd was the biggest. So that's a textbook example of Donald Trump gaslighting literally an entire nation worth of people, right? They're saying objectively the crowd was smaller. He's like, nope, you're wrong. Lived experience, who cares? Don't need this photographic evidence. I had the biggest crowd ever. That's the end of it, right? So it's a really good example of gaslighting. Another good one that's a little bit lighthearted is I actually, not intentionally, not nefariously, gaslight my romantic partner, Bob, all the time. He's somebody who's very ticklish. And I will often, go to like lovingly pat his arm, like as one does when you've been dating somebody for 15 years and you want to make them feel nice. So I'll pat his arm and he'll jump and he'll go, oh my God, that tickles. And then I go, no, that doesn't tickle. I just patted your arm. Why would that tickle? Which is a deeply ridiculous response because I have no way of telling whether or not it tickled him. He's the only one who can know that. So when I say, no, that doesn't tickle, I'm invalidating his experience of it, which is the only valid experience of it. And I'm actually gaslighting him, right? So this is something that happens on the national stage by American presidents, creating a massive culture of distrust and later QAnon, and also in tiny, ridiculous ways in everyday relationships. And probably most of us have done this at some point. So you're getting, I hope, a little bit of a flavor of what gaslighting is, but just in case you're not, I'm going to give you what I think is just the most fun and the best example of gaslighting, courtesy of my favorite rapper from the early 2000s, Shaggy. So y'all may remember from way, way back in the day, Shaggy had one of his biggest hits, It Wasn't Me. And in It Wasn't Me, what happens is that his good friend, Rick Rock, who also sings on the song, comes and talks to him about a relationship dilemma that he's having. You see, Rick Rock, who is dating a wonderful woman and has given her the keys to his house, has decided to cheat on this woman with the next door neighbor and has subsequently been caught in many, many compromising positions with this next door neighbor woman by said love of his life who has keys to his house. So he goes to Shaggy for advice about how to handle the situation. And this is how it goes. The woman says, hey, I caught you on the counter. And Shaggy's advice is, say it wasn't you. Then she says, well, I saw you, we'll say hugging on the sofa. We're going to keep this PG in this presentation. And of course, the answer is, it wasn't me. Well, she even saw him in the shower. We remember that from the song, famous line, but also it wasn't me. And even though she actually had photographic evidence of this, much like Donald Trump, Shaggy's response, just like Donald Trump, was, it wasn't me, right? So this lovely song, this 4-minute, 30-second miracle, or however long it is a perfect example of gaslighting. And poor Shaggy's girlfriend, by the end of it, is probably sitting there going, oh my God, can I even trust myself? And I know some of you are probably thinking, hold on, don't you mean Rick Rock's girlfriend? Isn't Rick Rock the guy that's cheating on his girlfriend? And yes, that's true. But by the end of the song, Rick Rock goes, yeah, Shaggy, I kind of think you're scum, and I'm probably just going to tell the truth to my girlfriend about what happened. So really, we need to worry about the woman that poor Shaggy is dating, because it's Shaggy's excellent attitude that just says, deny everything. Say it wasn't you. It's all on her. She missaw. She misunderstood. Textbook gaslighting, Shaggy. Thanks so much for the example. So Shaggy's girlfriend, when this happens, especially given how much Shaggy has done it, probably 15 times in these 4 minutes alone, is probably going to feel a lot of self-doubt from the situation. She won't be sure if she can really trust the way that she's perceiving the situation. And if this happens enough over time, she's actually going to start to become dependent on Shaggy to help her interpret reality, because she'll lose so much trust in her ability to understand what's going on. And he'll so consistently portray himself as the expert. Hey, that's not what happened. This is what happened. You're misunderstanding. That she will start to turn to him to help her interpret the world. And then that actually gives him more power to gaslight him even further. And the other thing that'll happen is she'll probably start to feel really depressed and really ashamed, because this is kind of a no-win situation. When you perceive the world a certain way, and the person that you love in this case, or maybe it's the president of your whole country or whatever's going on, keeps telling you that that's not true, it puts you in a really powerless position. It's hard for you to do anything about it. So you tend to get depressed, and you tend to be really ashamed that you can't quite catch the thread, that you can't quite get this figured out when it's so obvious for everybody else. Like how all of you are about Rebecca Black. No, I'm kidding. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the basics of how this happens. What are the key components to gaslighting? So I've got a friendly little checklist for you, but the deal is with this checklist, friends, that you're using this checklist to spot gaslighters, not to become one, okay? A crucial distinction. Please use this to spot them. So thing number one about gaslighting is you want to deny, or if you can't deny, just minimize somebody's lived experience, right? So we've got the classic Shaggy, like, yeah, you saw me hugging on the sofa, but that wasn't me, completely denying the experience. Or he could just minimize it. Sure, you saw me hugging on the sofa, but I don't think it's a really big deal because you and I had agreed that I wouldn't hug other women in the shower, but we never discussed the sofa, so I don't think this is a big deal. Minimizing the perceived harm is another way of doing this. Another thing that you could do is intentionally misunderstand. So when Shaggy's girlfriend goes and says, hey, I don't like that you're cheating on me, he could completely misunderstand this as an attack on how much she loves him. How could you accuse me of cheating? I thought that you loved me. If you loved me, you would never do this. And he's misunderstood that what she's asking for is for him to stop cheating, and instead turned it into a conversation about whether or not she loves him enough. The other thing that you can do is paint them as unreasonable. So, hey, if you were a cooler girlfriend, you wouldn't care that I was sleeping with the girl next door. What an unreasonable position for you to have. You can take offense or overreact to the situation. So you can go, how dare you question whether I'm loyal to you? This is so unfair after everything I've done for you, and so on. Or my personal favorite, you're too fill in the blank. My favorite is sensitive. You're too sensitive. Probably what Shaggy would have said. You're too sensitive. Stop worrying about this. So that's a kind of a basic blueprint for spotting a gaslighter and or being one. If you recognize yourself in the list, please stop doing any of the behaviors with the check mark beside it. Now, if we really want to up the ante on this and make the gaslighting even more pernicious, there's a couple key ways that we can do that. So the first ingredient that we'd want to add if we wanted to make gaslighting extra terrible is a power imbalance. Anytime there's a power imbalance where one person is more powerful than the other, it gives them an advantage to make their gaslighting a little more sticky, to make the other person question whether or not, they don't fully understand the way the world works. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how that looks. So a really common one that many people will have experience with is like an adult-child relationship. So basically with our parents. So you see this a lot in for example, homes with addiction, where, children will sort of suspect that maybe there's, for example, too much drinking going on, and everybody says, no, what drinking? Everything's fine and normal. So because of the power dynamic, because children are so dependent on adults to help them understand the world, but also for all of their basic needs, it makes it much more likely that the kid reaches for that, oh, maybe it's me, maybe I don't understand explanation. Another common place we'll see this, especially at work, is between bosses and subordinates, because we depend on our bosses, again, just like sort of like when we're kids, we depend on them for promotions, for how much we make, for feedback about our own performance, especially, that's a big one. Their interpretation of the world carries a lot of weight for us. And that puts that extra hand on the scale for, oh, maybe they get it and I totally don't. You'll also see it, even if there's no explicit power like there is in boss and subordinate relationships, you'll also see it even just with senior and junior, where somebody's providing like technical mentorship or something like that, because they're perceived as having more experience and understanding, the industry or the technical issue better. That gives them a very similar edge to what you'd get from your boss, even if they don't actually control your paycheck. And surprisingly, you'll even see it between therapists and patients. Now, you wouldn't expect to see this in some ways because, heck, aren't therapists supposed to explicitly not emotionally abuse their clients, right? Of course, the answer is yes. But what can happen, especially if you are a patient that's working with mental health issues with a therapist, is that because you're working on your mental health and you're relying on your therapist to help you interpret the world and understand how you relate to it, it's very easy, if the therapist is not careful, to slip into a dynamic where they're making the calls and they have that elevated position of dictating how the world should be perceived. So it's not uncommon to see it there, unfortunately, as well. Okay, so power dynamics are key to increasing the effectiveness or the likelihood of gaslighting becoming really a difficult thing. And the second ingredient is what I like to call the outsider effect. So the outsider effect really happens anytime you've got people who have uncommon viewpoints or different lived experiences. So this is really anybody who's in a marginalized position within the group. So it could be, women in male-dominated industries are an excellent example of that, because by definition, if we're in a male-dominated industry, there's not a lot of us. And so, you see this with things like, years ago, I think it was like Apple Watch or something, didn't have a pregnancy mode. Maybe it still doesn't. I don't have an Apple Watch, so I'm not sure, but didn't have a pregnancy mode because it was programmed entirely by men. And so they, anytime you, gained weight or something, they'd go, oh, time to lose weight, which is toxic on its own. Like, let's not empower diet culture here. But they'd go, oh, you've gained a bunch of weight, you better, go running or do something else, when actually it's pregnancy and it's very normal. Losing weight during pregnancy is actually not what you'd want. But because they are men and they don't experience that, they didn't understand that they'd have to develop for it. But if you had been a woman in that meeting and you had said, hey, I think we need to consider, periods and pregnancy as part of this health tracking app, that's an idea that might have gotten shot down, because they'd go, nah, I don't think it matters that much for, the initial release. Maybe that's something we add later on in version 2, version 3, or something like that. So anytime you are an outsider, where you come from a different background, you have a different lived experience in the world, this will create a scenario where you're more likely to have that separation between how you think the world is and how a whole other team of people do, which sets you up for that gaslighting dynamic to exist, right? And you'll see this as well too, with like people who are neurodivergent or disabled in some way. This will be really common as well, because people don't have an experience of the way that the world presents for somebody who's disabled, the way that they have to navigate the world, or for somebody who's neurodivergent, the way that they think and the conditions that they need for the world to kind of function well, right? Okay, and then ingredient number 3 that is really essential is repetition. Gaslighting one time is not going to send anybody into a crisis wondering if they can trust themselves, usually, right? Usually takes a little more than once. And this is kind of weird, right? Because, earlier I asked you whether or not we had experienced gaslighting, or if we knew what it was. A lot of us know. I assume we know, not just because it's been a hot topic in the media, but maybe because we've had some experience with it ourselves. And most people aren't like manipulative monsters, right? Like, I don't know about you, but like, how many of us actually woke up this morning and went like, woo, I can't wait to like emotionally abuse some folks at work. Hooray, right? Anybody in the chat woke up like that, or is it just me? I think it's probably just me, right? I'm probably the only person other than Kayla who's interested in manipulating everybody every day, right? And so we don't do that. We don't go out into the world trying to harm people usually. And yet there are so many people who have experienced this. So how does this happen? Like, what's going on? And the reason that this happens, and the reason that we end up susceptible to gaslighting, is because the repetition doesn't have to be recent. It's not like I have to gaslight you repeatedly in 4 minutes like I'm Shaggy, right? I can actually dole it out over the entirety of your life, or I can even have other people dole it out over the entirety of your life. And then, later when you innocuously pat your honey on the arm and he says it's ticklish, and then you're gaslighting him, then that's a bit tougher, right? Because of the pre-programmed experience with gaslighting that comes before. So a history with gaslighting is a really essential piece of the puzzle to find out if the gaslighting is going to take hold and be upsetting. So the places that you'll most commonly see this are parents and relatives. It's really common that we end up getting set up with this in our childhood. I mentioned before, like homes with addictions or anything like that. And we also tend to see it quite a lot with romantic partners, where, in these relationships where we're incredibly close and constantly having to navigate together the way that we're going to live, we of course often end up in conflict, and can, if there's a power dynamic or somebody who doesn't have good coping and arguing skills, end up getting gaslit, and then end up constantly throughout the rest of our lives, if we get exposed to it enough, reaching for that, oh my God, is it me? Oh my God, I don't understand the world. This person's got it figured out, but I don't. because you've seen that happen so much that you slip naturally into that pattern. And I also want to say, you know, it didn't fit nicely on the slide there for formatting reasons, but like, you know, we talk about like gaslighting history coming from, you know, family or romantic partners. It also comes from like literally all of society for traditionally marginalized folks, right? Like most interactions when we talk about, you know, microaggressions or something like that, many, many times we'll run into the world where we're the only one with a particular viewpoint. Everybody else thinks that we're way off base, and we're sort of stuck into that gaslighting loop again. Okay, so we know the equation now. We want to take a healthy dose of denial of lived experience, and then we want to multiply that by any power differentials we can scrounge up, by any amount of outsider experience that exists in our lives, and then all the repetition we've had since the day that we were born. And that is going to get us our gaslighting quotient or something like that, right? And you might be asking at this point, like, hey, what about gender? It's right there in the title, Holly. We haven't talked about it at all. So let's talk about it. And we could easily call out any other intersectional identity here as well. Gender is the one that we're going to talk about now. But, you know, as I mentioned, any experience of marginalization or being one of only a few or being one of only one against a large group of others or amongst a large group of others will create this. And we're just going to talk about the particular things about gender that really like amp things up. So gender dynamic one that enables gaslighting is our historical power distribution. And when I say historical, I also definitely mean current, to be clear. But, you know, talking historically, like it was not that long ago that women couldn't vote, right? Like within my grandmother's lifetime, it was not possible for women to vote. And really only in the last, you know, however long it's been, 100 years or something like that, we've been able to vote. And by the way, like, you know, for Indigenous women in Canada, that was, I think, 1963 that they got the vote. Like, this is recent. This is not that long ago that very explicit power in a democracy, like the ability to vote, was not allowed in women's hands or certain women's hands for much, much longer, right? And, you know, even, you know, back in like the 1960s or something like that, like if you remember watching on Mad Men, when Betty Draper wanted to get a divorce, she had to seek permission from her husband to do it. So not only did she not work outside of the home and not have any financial power, and not only that, so she would have trouble leaving the relationship or taking any control because she doesn't have the financial privilege, but she also has to ask permission to be allowed to leave, which is just a huge gap in power, huge gap in power. And similarly, another example from that same show, Betty Draper, when she went to see a psychiatrist at some point in, I think it was season 1 or something, the psychiatrist did not report his findings about her mental health to her, but rather reported it to her husband. And again, you know, this is 50, 60 years ago. This is not that long ago. And so this is the generation of our grandmothers, the generation of our mothers as well at that time. And that reverberates over time, even if that's not the current situation. If I go and see a therapist now, they don't call up my honey and tell them all about their findings, and I can just go and get divorced if I want to, right? But even though that's not the case now, we still live with all the reverberations through society of those things. That's still present in the way that my grandmother raised my mother, in the way that my mother raised me, in the way that all of us were raised, right? So that's one thing, is that the people who have had power traditionally have been cisgender men. Secondly, women's opinions have been less valued traditionally than men's opinions. So I mentioned earlier that historically men have held power, right? And a really normal, natural human being thing to do is to pay a lot of attention to the person that has power. The person who has the power to determine your economic future or your physical safety is somebody that you should pay a lot of attention to, make sure that you are aligned with, and make sure that you kind of appease in some ways, because that's a really good strategy for staying safe and making sure you can pay your rent and all of those kinds of things, right? So in a large scale way and in a small scale way, we tend to pay attention and give weight to the opinions of people who have power to determine, you know, key aspects of our lives. And for most of history, that's been men, right? I mean, even if you look at political power as a great example of that, like, you know, there's how many female head of states right now? Like less than 10, maybe less than 5. You know, I haven't done a count lately, but not many. And in Canada, we've had precisely one head of state here that was a woman, and it was a temporary situation after somebody else had resigned, and it was back in the 90s, and it ended before you could blink, right? So we have not occupied that position of power very often or for very long when we have. And as a result, people don't pay as much attention to the things that we have to say because it's, in theory, less consequential to them than the opinions of somebody that does have the power. So the result of this is that the people with power's opinions get amplified and the people without the power's opinions are less valued because people see them as less consequential. And that is something that we're raised with from a very young age. And so we learn and reinforce this idea that this other person and the way that they see the world is more important than ours. And we talked earlier about how that's a key element of gaslighting, right? Is that I understand the world and you don't. So therefore you have to listen to me and depend on me to correctly interpret the world. And then the last gender dynamic that I want to call out are some specific sort of female coded behaviors, things that we're trained to do from a young age. So two in particular that I want to talk about are peacekeeping and emotional caretaking. So emotional caretaking is when we take responsibility for other people's emotional health. So I don't recall if I did this today, but really, quite commonly, if I stand up on stage to do this talk in person, like back in the old days, I'd stand up and say, hey, everybody, how are you doing? Like, are you feeling tired this morning? Because everybody had their coffee. And that is caretaking the audience, right? I'm checking in and making sure that they're all feeling good before I deliver my message, right? This is a thing that women are taught to do in various ways. That's just one of them, where we're making sure above all else that other people feel safe, secure, and happy, and that's our job, is something that we learn very, very early. And then peacekeeping, on the other hand, is a variation on that, where if there's ever a fight going on, or there could be a fight going on, it's up to us to fix it. So what that often looks like for women is subsuming whatever it is that they need or want to keep the peace. So if someone really wants to, maybe my partner wants to go on vacation to Hawaii, and I've always wanted to go to Rome, but I think he's going to throw a bit of a fit if we don't go to Hawaii, then I might avoid having that fight and instead just go to Hawaii. Let me be clear, he would not throw a fit if we didn't go to Hawaii, but you get the idea, right? It's subsuming the thing that you want to keep the peace and make it so that there is harmony and no fights happening, and also so that you're emotionally caretaking somebody else. So these two behaviors are both strategies that women use that effectively result in, again, them taking that lower power position within a pair, right? Where the other person, their needs, their concerns, their emotions are dominant, and your job is to sort of serve and protect everything that's going on up there. So that creates that power imbalance that we were talking about earlier that helps fuel the gaslighting. So it's really like a perfect storm. It's no fun to be in the situation where, you are, in a male dominated industry, part of a small group, so therefore more likely to have that outsider view where the power dynamics explicitly within the group probably often don't favor you, but also historically, because of the way we've all been raised, and currently because of the way we've been trained to peacekeep and emotional caretake, and the way that other people have been trained, by the way, to expect that. I'm not sort of trying to lay this on women and go, well, if you just didn't peacekeep and emotional caretake, then nobody would ever gaslight you. Like, that's not true. But it is a part of the dynamic that has two sides, where we do the peacekeeping and they readily expect and accept the peacekeeping and stuff like that, that helps enable this, right? So we create this perfect storm where gaslighting is really often a go-to, where we have a lot of historical context for it, and it becomes easy to fall into. So let's talk about some workplace effects of gaslighting. So what if we're seeing this at work and not just in a Shaggy song? What would that look like? Well, people who are being gaslit at work would probably end up silencing their viewpoints and their opinions, which makes total sense. If you think your viewpoints and opinions are wrong and everybody berates you and gets upset with you every time you share them, the best idea is to stop doing that and then stop getting mad at you, right? So you're heavily incentivized to not say as much so that you don't attract as much ire from the rest of the world. The other thing that you'll see is that they'll be less creative and they'll take less healthy risks. Again, because if every time you're creative and offer an interesting idea or even a non-controversial idea, you kind of get stomped on and told you've got it wrong, it doesn't help you to step out of line more and take even more risk and expose yourself to even more of that critique. Instead, it makes sense to be smaller. Don't step outside of the normal boundaries. Do everything that everyone else would do. Don't try anything new and don't take any risks, right? And as well, you probably won't take on any high profile projects or go for promotions or go for big raises. Because if you feel like you've got shaky balance and you're not quite sure how to walk in your shoes, the last thing you're going to do is volunteer to go walk on a high wire where everybody's watching you fall down, right? What happens is, to protect themselves from the pain of the gaslighting and from the reputational risk that can come from it when it's done publicly, people tend to avoid attracting attention. So they don't take on big projects, which are often the projects that you need to do to get promoted, to move ahead, to justify large raises. And so all of these things result in, less impactful ideas being advanced by women, more of the status quo, which is ironically, when we talk about hiring women or hiring different marginalized groups, like we're trying to, in theory, increase diversity so that we have less groupthink and a broader set of ideas. But when this is going on, we absolutely squash that, right? And at the end of the day, we don't end up moving up the chain of command because we've been so incentivized to not do any of the behaviors that would help us do that. Yuck. No fun. Ugh. What a fun presentation, Holly. So glad we're doing it. Okay, so now what? Now that I've depressed you all and made this really, really tragic, let's talk about how to deal with this. So I'm going to go through here. Yeah, Kayla, it's going to get more uplifting. Don't worry. I'm going to go through here how to deal with gaslighting if you're a victim of gaslighting. I'm also going to talk about how to deal with gaslighting if you are the manager and you're seeing gaslighting going on. I don't think I have any, I don't recall, but I don't think I have any actual slides about how to deal if you are the gaslighter. So I'll just tell you now, stop it. That's how you do it. All those behaviors that I talked about and all the ways to increase it, delete those one by one from your behaviors and you'll be on your way, okay? So let's talk about how to deal with this if you're a victim. Level 1, the first thing you should try, to the extent that you want to, is ask nicely. So here's a formula with literal scripts. You can screenshot this, try not to get any faces other than mine in the screenshots, but here's some scripts. So step 1 is to validate them. Hey, I know that you think I'm overreacting, or I hear that you're not doing this on purpose, but then you state your feelings. This makes me feel uncomfortable anyways, or this is important to me. And then finally, ask them to change. Stop it, right? So, hey, I know you think I'm overreacting, but this is really important to me. Can you please stop? Asking nicely. Try that. Sometimes people will go, oh my God, I didn't realize I was being a monster, and then stop being a monster. And that's really nice because it's way less work than any of the subsequent approaches. So step number 1 is ask nicely. Step number 2 is go and get some support. So it's really essential if you are somebody who is experiencing gaslighting that you find people who believe you. Because the threat here, the threat of gaslighting, is that you feel like nobody believes you and that you've got it totally wrong. So you want to bolster the other side of that. If the gaslighters got their hand on this side of the scale that says you don't get the world and you're kind of terrible, you want to find some weight to stick on your side of the scale that says, no, actually you're fine and you understand the world perfectly and life's kind of okay. So find people who believe you, friends, family, colleagues, a good therapist, people at WIMD, all of those are options. Then you want to try to get some powerful people on your side. So in the context of work, that's going to be your manager and HR. It'll be senior folks on the team or anybody who's really influential. So sometimes the most influential people aren't the ones who are the most senior or aren't the people who have an explicit position of power, but the people who are able to convince people either through positional authority, through technical expertise, or just through, talent and relationships. Those are the people that you want to have on your side so that you have kind of a good army beside you. And then those allies that you've created, you want to get them to intervene on your behalf. So if somebody is gaslighting you and saying, you know, hey, Holly, that mind plan that you produced, none of us agreed to it. If you can get an influential colleague to say, actually, we did agree to it. I was in that meeting 2 weeks ago. Don't you remember? That'll be really helpful, because suddenly now it's not just you against them. It's somebody else, and somebody who they really respect who's against them. And crucially, what I want you to do here, really all the time, anytime you're dealing with any kind of HR issue at work, is document, document, document. Okay? You document it, and crucially, get your allies to document it. If you ever end up in a situation where you're having to have a knockdown, drag out fight through HR, so somebody does or does not get fired, and hopefully it's not you, you need to have documentation in place, but corroborating documentation from other people who don't have a vested interest in the situation is really, really helpful. So get the allies to intervene, and then get them to write themselves a little note about it, or send a contemporaneous email like, hey, weird what Steve said in the meeting today. So glad I corrected him. Send, something like that. Okay, then level 3 is to create some boundaries. So we've got to figure out what they are. So with regards to the person who's gaslighting you, some questions that you should ask yourself are, what are you actually willing to do in relationship to them? What are some things that you don't want to put up with? And what's the limit of your responsibility? So these are 3 important questions, because we often take too much responsibility, own too much of the conflict ourselves, and kind of let them get away with painting us as the villain. So understand what the limit is of what you're willing to be responsible for. Understand what the limit is of what you're willing to put up with, and vice versa, what you're not willing to put up with, and what you're actually willing to do in relationship with them. Then you've got to communicate those boundaries to the gaslighter, but also crucially to your manager and to HR. Anytime you are setting a boundary at work that's going to mean that you do your work differently or less, or might be seen as being less collaborative, get buy-in from your manager and HR before anybody ever has to report it to them. You want them to know why this is happening, how you're doing it, and you want them to agree that you should be doing it. And then once you've set those boundaries, which might be something like, you know, I'm willing to talk about my mind plans with you, but I'm not willing to talk anymore about the validity of mind plans that have already been signed off on last week. That's a reasonable boundary to make. You have to stick with them. Once you make the boundary that says you're not going to talk about the mind plans after they've already been signed off, you cannot get pulled into a conversation about them, because then you've basically just made a threat and an ultimatum and taken all the power out of it, because you kind of caved on it. So it's important that you actually back yourself and stick to those boundaries. So before you set the boundary, make sure it's one that you can actually stick to. If you set boundaries you can't stick to, I would way prefer that you set a smaller boundary that you absolutely can. And every time you have to reinforce your boundary and stick to it, document it. Document, document, document. Document everything, okay? Great. Level 4, if none of that works, is leave. Here's why this is level 4, because this is a tough situation. If you have tried asking nicely, if you've tried getting other people on your side to help you out, and if you've tried setting boundaries and it's still not working and you're still getting gaslit, it's tough to see how this situation gets solved. Most people don't spontaneously go, oh my God, I've been a monster. I'm going to change instantaneously and stop forever. You know, even if they did have that realization, which most people don't, they then have to actually go and implement it, which usually takes a lot of time. So even the person with the best intention who wants to stop doing this differently usually won't stop doing it overnight, or might not even stop doing it to the level that you want. If they're doing a ton of gaslighting and they generate a little bit of awareness and they stop doing it just in this one little category, and it takes them 3 months to implement, congratulations, you've got a 5% reduction in the emotional abuse you're suffering at work, right? So that's part of why leave is level 4. And I recognize this may not be actually possible for everybody, right? But to the extent that it is possible, find a new job, a new team, a new manager, a new mentor, or a new project. Wherever the gaslighting is coming from, try to change it there. But know that the change doesn't always have to come from finding an entirely new place to be employed. It might just come from finding new people to associate with in your current employment. Then if you've got to leave, go no contact with the person who's gaslighting you if possible. If you're going to do this, you'll have to involve your manager and HR. This is the kind of thing that will get you fired if you're not careful. So it's essential that if you're going to stop communicating with somebody, especially if they're crucially related to your role in some way, that you tell HR and your manager that that's the plan. Otherwise, you might later get blamed for the relationship falling apart. And another thing you can do is communicate only when you have witnesses present. If somebody is persistently going to be gaslighting you, then I recommend that you always have other people there who can corroborate from your side what's happening and make sure you document and make sure they document, to the extent that it's not possible for you to actually get away from the person doing the gaslighting. Great. If you cannot get support for these things, go. And by support, I mean, there's a whole bunch of times here where I mentioned talk to your manager, talk to HR, get them to sign on. If they don't sign on to this, the chances of you being successful at this are so much smaller. You can try it, but especially if somebody's been successfully gaslighting you for a long time and there's institutional support for that gaslighting, like if the gaslighting is happening from more than one person, it's really, really tough for you to successfully set boundaries, successfully defend your ability to not debate the undebatable, and not end up in HR's office with somebody else complaining about you. And worse, with somebody else complaining about you and 3 other people corroborating it. So you don't want to end up in a situation where that's the case. And if you don't end up getting support from your manager and from HR, I'm not saying it's a done deal, but that's a much more likely scenario. So support from those people is absolutely crucial for you being successful. If you can't get it, it's totally okay to leave if that's possible for you. Okay, now let's talk about the other side, the managers. People have a little more power. What a lovely situation for them. Let's see how, if you're a manager and you see somebody gaslighting somebody else on your team, how you can deal with that. So dealing with the gaslighters first. Number 1, stand up for the victims that are on your team. Challenge the gaslighters' assertions that are wildly incorrect or deeply accusatory, and ask questions to deconstruct what's really going on. Hey, Shaggy, I hear you saying that it wasn't you, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have this video evidence. Who do you imagine this was in the video if not you? Isn't this your birthmark, Shaggy, etc.? Okay, so stand up for your victims and make sure that the gaslighters' assertions don't go unchallenged. That's probably, as a victim, that's one of the toughest things to have happen to you, is when your manager just allows it to keep happening. So make sure you interrupt it. Then use the same 4 levels, by the way, as your employee uses. Level 4 is actually not, by the way, the employee leaving, it's the gaslighter leaving. But you want to make sure that you're following all those exact same steps with the gaslighter as your employee would. Same approach, coordinated efforts, okay? And if you can, change the power dynamic. So make it so that the gaslighting victim doesn't report in to the gaslighter, or make it so that they're not dependent on them for code review or something like that. Make it so that the power playing field between them is more level, if possible, through explicit dynamics, like who's assigned to work with who, or who's assigned to report to who, or get them away. And you'll see this quite often. Like it's really frustrating where, in the States, somebody very, very powerful, I'm thinking about like, cases at like some of these big tech companies, like with Andy Rubin and like, Uber and stuff like that. Like it'll often be the case where somebody very, very powerful is being abusive to somebody much more junior. And then the solution that HR comes up with around that, or that management comes up with around that, is, oh, okay, well, this person's so important and we can't possibly get rid of them. So instead, we'll take this person here, take them away from the field that they've been working in for the last 10 years and move them over to a completely different department, so they effectively have to start their career over. Friends, that's a garbage solution. Don't do that to people. That sucks, right? It's got to be the gaslighter to go, not the victim. Otherwise, all you're doing is enabling this kind of abuse and making it okay within your org. So make sure that if you are changing the power dynamic, you're not changing the power dynamic in a way that disadvantages the victim. Like they didn't do something wrong here. It shouldn't be their price to pay. Okay, how to deal with victims who are on your team. I want you to seek out their opinions. Really try to actively listen to the things they have to say really try to understand their point of view, validate their point of view, and explain the decisions that you're making to them and to everybody else on the team, so that they can see that if you, maybe you're not side, if you don't side with them, for example, you're not siding with them, not because they misunderstand the world, but because maybe, there's a financial advantage to doing it some other way, or something like that. So you want to make sure that when you're working with them, you're fully understanding what they have to say, those uncommon viewpoints. And to the extent that you've got to, not go along with what they've said, make sure you're really explaining that with reasons other than you suck and you don't understand the world. Then I want you to challenge groupthink within your group. This is probably going to be the biggest challenge that you'll have as a manager here, other than maybe, trying not to give golden parachutes to abusers. But, really, if you've got an entire group of people that are working on gaslighting somebody, you're going to have to challenge that groupthink, get in the way, ask questions, get them to think broader, think outside the box, and use the privilege that you have as manager to get them to consider other ways of thinking about it. Because what happens is they get stuck into thinking about it from one angle, and then that further reinforces the difference between them and the outsider that is often the victim of the gaslighting. And finally, and this is really essential, and if you're not sure how to do this, please come to WIMBY's talk next month. Ask the gaslighting victim what support they need. It's really easy when you're well-intentioned and when you see something going on to assume that they would like this particular type of support that you might like, or that you've heard works, or that Holly told you to do at this cool presentation that you went to the other night. Like, don't do any of that until you have a conversation with them. Go to them and say, hey, I've noticed this is happening to you. I'm really sorry. I want it to stop. How do I best support you? What would help you to make this have less of an impact? And it's okay if you make suggestions, like you can say, hey, Holly said I went to this cool presentation. Holly said I might do this. But the important part is you go, would you find that helpful? And actually get them to weigh in and get them to choose what the action looks like. So you're giving them some power back. All right, then with the entire team, once you've dealt with these two people, you've got a long list of things to do, managers, poor things. With the whole team, talk with them about gaslighting. If they don't know what this is, if they don't know how to identify this, tell them what it is, why it matters. Why do you want for your team? Like, I presume that most of you want for your team to not be suffering from emotional abuse and not be emotionally abusing each other. Say that out loud to your team. Maybe don't use the term emotional abuse, but say things like, I want you to be happy. I want us to communicate well, blah, 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 right? So tell them what you want, why it matters, and how this is relevant. And, heck, make them watch the presentation. Like, you can find this talk on YouTube with less Shaggy, but you can find it. Okay. And then I want you to make it clear to your entire team that you're open to hearing about it if gaslighting is happening, if it's happening to them, if they're seeing it happen to somebody else, that it's something that you want to know about, because information is going to be your friend here. If this is happening on your team, you need to know so that you can get involved and help resolve it. If you don't know, it'll happen under the surface and then you'll miss it. So make it clear that you want to hear about it from them, and hopefully they'll be feeling safe enough to report it. And then you've got to walk your talk. What does that mean? No more gaslighting, Holly Burton. I really have to stop patting my lovely partner on the arm and telling him if it doesn't tickle, right? You can't show up to your team and go, hey, gaslighting is really important. We've got to stop doing it. Tell me if it ever happens to you, and then be the one that's doing it to your team. So you really have to make sure to, take a look and keep your own house clean. Look and make sure that all the behaviors that we've talked about tonight are not things that you're doing. And if they are, clean that up, because your team will not trust you if they see you as part of the problem. Great. Okay, so that's a ton of conversation about emotional abuse and a whole bunch of different strategies that I hope y'all can use in your own self to help you not fall off that pink line and instead kind of inch yourself up the graph so you can stay a little bit longer, because, gaslighting is awful, no fun. I think nobody in this audience right now is like, I can't wait to date Shaggy. Like, no, thank you. I'm not in, right? It's not an amazing thing, and it really takes its toll. And I've seen, over the course of my coaching career, just so many people who are burnt out from being in these type of workplace situations. And it's expensive. It's expensive to go. Like, for me personally, like, leaving the mining industry and becoming a coach, I'm doing well. Like I make good money as a coach and stuff like that. But that decision, honestly, probably over the course of my career is going to cost me about $250,000. It's not cheap. It's not cheap to be part of this like pink line. It's not cheap monetarily. It's not cheap emotionally in terms of your mental health. It's not cheap in terms of any of that, right? So I hope that some of these strategies will help you avoid those kinds of situations. And if you're ever stuck, like come have a conversation with me, connect you to some resources, talk you through some of the things that you can do here, talk you through some of the things that you're not sure how to implement from this talk. I'm totally open to have a conversation.